Leonard Liggio, in exploring the race idea and raising a more general question about the differences between the English colonization practices and those of other Europeans, asks, how is it possible to explain the fact that the English developed the most racist attitudes towards the natives wherever they expanded or established overseas colonies?
What we're going into here is a behind-the-scenes look into why the English colonizers were more ruthless compared to other European colonizers when it came to the way that they dealt with the natives that they encountered in the Americas and other parts of the world as well, and why they set up that rigid racial system that they established. And so all the colonizers were ruthless, and that's without a doubt, right, when it came to dominating the vulnerable people. But the English were a special type of ruthless, because when they came to dominate, they came with the intention to dominate the land that the people lived on, the way that the people behaved, the way that the people named and identified themselves, and the way that the people interpreted the world around them when they lift up their eyes and they peep through those little bitty eyeballs on the front of their face. And so they came with the intention to dominate every square inch of people's life, identity, and reality. And this is one of the things that set them apart from other European colonizers. And so to get an understanding of how this mindset developed, we must take a look into the Irish mirror and examine the conflict between the Irish and the English. And this is over a period of a few centuries. And it's before and during the time that the English set out to explore the New World, right? And this period is what many historians are now today really starting to focus on. So with that being said, let's continue going on in the book right here, Race in North America by Dr. Audrey Smedley, and see if we can get some understanding.
He proposes a hypothesis that is now becoming a more general part of our understanding of history, that the English experience with the Irish was the root of English racial attitudes. Perhaps because of the intractable and seemingly irreconcilable contemporary conflict between these two peoples, other historians have turned their attention to this long-standing belligerence for insights into the general English attitudes toward indigenous peoples and the nature of their colonial and imperial policies.
The English attitude stemming from the Irish conflict is also covered extensively in the series of commentaries on the book The Invention of the White Race, Volume 1 by Theodore Allen. And so starting in the 12th century CE, there had been a number of attempts by the English to invade Ireland to take their lands, right, and to steal their mines. But the Irish were very persistent on rebelling and preventing this from happening. But there was only so much that the Irish could do to stave off the ruthless lords of dominion known as the English. And so let's go a little bit deeper into these two people's interactions over the centuries to see how well they got along.
The first English invasion and attempt to settle Ireland occurred under Henry II in 1169 and 1171 as part of the expansion of Anglo-Norman civilization following the Norman invasion of England.
The Norman invasion happened in the 11th century CE, and this is where a group of Normans, along with others like the French, were led by William the Conqueror to take over England, which they successfully did. And so the Anglo-Normans became a group of ruling class, and this is after the Norman invasion. And it was a mixture of the invading group with the Anglo-Saxon English, who were the people already in the land of England. And so real quick, for those who may not know, here is England on a map, right? And right here is Ireland, to give you a perspective on the proximity of these two places. And so this is what happened after the invasion of Ireland by the Anglo-Normans.
By the end of the century, most of Ireland had fallen under some semblance of English control in the form of Anglo-Norman barons, who had been given titles to Irish lands, which they ruled as personal fiefdoms.
They came in and stole much of the Irish land and started handing out titles of ownership to the land.
But the scattered Irish clans, lacking a centralized government, proved impossible to vanquish and control. Within a short time, they had regained much of their lands and embarked on the first of several great revivals of Gaelic culture, which flourished from time to time from the 13th through the 15th centuries.
But the Irish were not going down without a fight. They took back much of the land and they started bringing back the Gaelic culture. And so when the English came to take the land, they didn't just do that and that alone. They came to take the land and the mine, and they came trying to convert people into the English ways. And they do this so they can better understand how the people think and how the people act. And this makes it easier for them to control the people, right? But the Irish were not going for it so easily, which is one of the reasons that frustrated the English.
One development, however, was particularly upsetting and threatening to the nominal rulers of Ireland.
These rulers in Ireland were not Irish. They were English, so keep that in mind. And so one thing that was making the English rulers in Ireland so mad and jeopardizing their rulership was what?
Those Englishmen who had settled in Irish lands, called the Old English, especially in remote areas from the Pale, intermingled with the Irish and increasingly went native. That is, they assimilated to Irish culture and language.
The fact that the Irish started converting some of the English who settled in Ireland to the ways of the Irish was ruining the plan, because they weren't supposed to be over there becoming an Irish person. They were supposed to be turning the Irish into English. Uh-oh.
To halt what the English saw as an erosion of civilized culture and the degeneracy of Englishmen in Ireland, the English crown established legal restrictions forbidding Englishmen to wear Irish dress or hairstyles, speak the Irish language, or intermarry or trade with the Irish.
To stop the Englishmen in Ireland from transforming into Irish, the rulers back in England put down the hammer, right? And they used the tool of law to make it illegal for the Englishmen in Ireland to basically do anything that was Irish. And so obviously from the English view, they wouldn't want to keep losing people to the other side, because the more the English converted to being Irish, the more enemies they had to deal with.
These restrictions, the Statutes of Kilkenny, 1367, also outlawed Irish games, poetry, and music, apparently under the assumption that these cultural features were too seductive for young Englishmen to resist.
The Irish ways were way too seductive for the young Englishmen. And so who else today has a culture that's way too seductive for the youth? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Whatever it is, that's the answer. And so think about it, ponder it, and let the mind wander on it. Let's keep going.
The English were frustrated by their inability to establish complete suzerainty over Irish lands, some of which were in the control of Irish brigands, or to transform the natives and absorb them into English culture.
This is why I like Dr. Audrey Smedley, because she uses all the correct verbs to describe the process that was taking place. She says the English were hot because they couldn't fully control the land or transform the natives and absorb them into English culture. That means they were having a hard time trying to implant those ideas into the Irish mind. What they were trying to do is they were trying to eradicate the thinking pattern of the Irish, right? And then replace that pattern with new thinking patterns that came from themselves, which is the only way that you can change someone's behavior, right? You have to change the way that people think and the way that they feel about the thoughts that they think, which results in the expression of actions or the things a person or a group does. And so the English, they were trying to reprogram the Irish, and they were frustrated because it wasn't working. Come on with it.
Throughout the period of English attempts to subdue these lands and peoples, one ostensible objective was to spread English civilization.
The ostensible or the outer reason or the surface goal was to turn the Irish into an English person.
But the underlying reality and primary aim was the confiscation of Irish lands, the establishment of an agrarian economy, and the exploitation of native labor.
But the secret goal or the goal behind closed doors was to steal the land. Right, and it was also to use the land to produce crops to be sold, and then use the native Irish as cheap laborers to produce the crops. And so the English, they were having a difficult time putting this in place, as we can see.
The English attitude toward the Irish, almost from the beginning of penetration into the Western Island, was contempt for Irish culture and lifestyles. This was matched by intense Irish hatred of all that was English.
Intense hatred on both sides. These people did not like each other one bit. The English hated everything about the Irish, and the Irish hated everything that was English.
Thus, extreme ethnocentrism ensued between these two peoples early in the contact period, a common result in situations in which one group of peoples attempts to conquer another. But the conflict was not only based on the ethnic chauvinism of two peoples competing for political supremacy, as was the case in many other confrontations among the emerging nation-states of Europe. The hostility between the Irish and English ran much deeper. It exemplified an age-old struggle, symbolized in biblical times by the conflict between Cain and Abel that has recurred repeatedly in many places throughout history.
Cain and Abel is symbolic of warring forces that we witness between opposing groups and also with opposing thoughts within our very own mind. And so Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, white and black people, these demonstrate this concept along with others that the doctor mentions next.
The clash between nomadic or semi-nomadic pastoralists and peoples who had settled on the land as farmers and cultivated a sedentary way of life.
Nomadic peoples didn't view the land as something to be owned. They used it for the purpose of feeding their animals and temporary shelter. And when the seasons changed, they got up and they left and they went somewhere else, right? But sedentary people stay in one place, and they stay in one place for an extended period. And because they do so, they segment out pieces of land as private property, in which the case is, this belongs to me and that belongs to you. Both views, like everything else, have their pros and cons. But the point is that these are two very different approaches to life. The Irish were more nomadic and the English were more stationary.
This was a fundamental conflict between two very different lifestyles, two different views of the world, two different value systems, two different sets of problems and solutions for them. The Gaelic peoples of Ireland shared many of the habits and customs of nomadic peoples in the Old World. As a herding people, their greatest form of wealth and most strategic resource was their cattle. But techniques of growing crops were not unknown, and many Irish families grew some barley and oats, primarily to feed their animals during the long winter months. Farming, however, was not considered fitting for a man's major occupation. It was generally left to women. A man's herd was the source of his prestige and pride, and families spent their lifetimes trying to increase the size of their herds. Like all pastoralists, the Irish believed that their way of life was superior to the wretched lives of farmers, valuing above all the freedom that it gave them. English culture, by contrast, was ordered, structured, and controlled. From the standpoint of English cultural values, Irish utilization of the land was a monstrous waste. The rich soil that their animals trampled could be put to better use cultivating grains, vegetables, and other goods to be marketed abroad and in expanding urban centers.
The English also interpreted the Native Americans' use of the land in a similar way. To them, it looked like the land was being wasted, right? So they felt that it was their right to own it, since these people were not doing anything with it, or not doing anything with it that was productive from an English perspective. And so in regards to the Irish land, the English felt that they were wasting it, right? And so they had their beady eyes on their land.
Moreover, the younger sons of English gentlemen, who had no hopes of inheriting paternal lands, could earn their fortunes from great estates that would be established in Ireland with the aid of Irish labor.
The younger son had no hopes of inheriting any land because the land was inherited by the first son in the feudal system that they had established. And so the younger son said, since I don't get any land from my pops, that good old Irish land is looking mighty delicious, right? And I need that.
Yet all attempts to force Irishmen to settle on the land were rebuffed.
Those attempts were shot down. You're not going to just run up on the Irish and think that you can steal the land and convert the Irish into Englishmen. Oh no, not without an exhausting fight to the death.
When the English met their intransigence by confiscating and destroying their cattle, the Irish fled into the forest and let it be known that they preferred starvation to life as forced laborers on English farms.
When the English met the Irish intransigence or refusal to agree or compromise, the English put to death the cattle and they tore up the land, right? And the Irish tucked off into the forest, and they said that they would rather starve to death than to be a slave or to get their minds taken by the English.
The contempt and hatred that the English had for Irish culture was expressed by Geraldus Cambrensis as early as 1187. They are a wild and inhospitable people. They live on beasts only and live like beasts. This people despises agriculture, has little use for the money-making of towns. He described their uncleanliness, their flowing hair and beards infested with lice, their barbarous dress, and their laziness. They think that the greatest pleasure is not to work, and the greatest wealth is to enjoy liberty.
This is also one of the opposing viewpoints that the Irish and the English had. The Irish didn't believe in working hard like the English, and so they would rather just chill out and relax. And man, the English hated this.
During the final years of the 9 Years' War, many Irishmen were driven off to Western Ireland, and their primary form of wealth, their cattle, was destroyed. Lands were taken over by the younger sons of English gentry, who subsequently set about creating an agricultural and commercial society.
These are those younger sons we talked about earlier who had no inheritance of their father's land. Well, they found out a way to get some land, and this land was inherited by the sword.
The Irish who remained were reduced to involuntary laborers.
Uh-oh, they're breaking them down now. Let's see what happens.
Under English law, they were not allowed to own land, hold office, be apprenticed to any skill or craft, or serve on juries.
Here they go, putting the hammer down with the tool of law in typical English fashion.
Their principal identity was that of cheap labor.
Uh-oh, your role on this earth in this lifetime is to be a person we use for cheap labor. Oh, snaps. Will the Irish go down completely? Is this the end?
Toward the middle of the 17th century, another, more widespread rebellion by Irishmen and some of the Old English took place.
It was not the end. The Irish still had more fight in them. But let's see how this went.
This was followed by extremely repressive measures on the part of the English under Oliver Cromwell. According to Liggio, Cromwell's army in Ireland, often New England Puritan-led or inspired, carried out the most complete devastation that Ireland experienced until that time.
Uh-oh, the vicious English back on the attack. Come on with it.
Extermination became a policy. Massacres were carried out. Prisoners of war were transported to servitude in the new English colonies in the West Indies.
The ruthless English, the lords of domination, came back with a heavy fire in all efforts to take down the Irish. They waged an all-out killing spree, and they shipped the Irish who they had caught over to the West Indies to serve in the field and on the plantations.
Ireland, like New England, was taken with the Bible in one hand, the sword in the other.
Ireland, like New England, like many parts of Africa, like the West Indies, like the Americas, like parts of India, and like other places taken with the permission from God, with the Bible in one hand and with hot firepower in the other.
Lord Clarendon observed that the Cromwellian policy was to act without any humanity to the Irish nation, and more especially to those of the old native extraction, the whole race whereof they had upon the matter sworn an utter extirpation. The significance of this brutal treatment and the transport of large numbers of captive peoples of both sexes to the sugar plantations in the West Indies rested upon the growing image of the Irish as something less than human, as a people whose capacity for civilization was stunted.
This sounds familiar, doesn't it? English imagined the Irish to be less than human, just like they imagined the Negro and the Native Americans to be less than human, right? And the creation of this type of image in their minds allowed them to be just as brutal as they desired to be and still be able to sleep at night.
This view took form slowly, but was perhaps common among the English elite by the early 17th century.
The English elite were the ones with the master plan. While everyone else was out busy working and doing hard physical labor all day, the English elite were busy all day and all night focusing on the idea of domination and formulating thoughts that allowed them to manifest that idea in the physical world.
Unremitting disdain for the customs and habits of the wild Irish is found throughout the literature of the 16th and 17th centuries. Edmund Campion, himself a Catholic, excoriated the Irish for their supposed cannibalism, their lewd marriage customs. They had trial marriages and sometimes engaged in polygamy and free sexual behavior, and their whores and strumpets too vile and abominable to write of. And Barnabe Rich, in his 1610 description of the Irish people, their manners and their customs, claimed that the Irish were educated in treason and rebellion and theft and robbery and superstition and idolatry. In their resistance to British civilization, Rich noted, the Irish had rather still retained themselves in their sluttishness and their uncleanliness, in their rudeness, and in their inhuman loathsomeness, than they would take any example from the English, either of civility, humanity, or any manner of decency.
And there you have it, a short breakdown of the history of the hatred between the English and the Irish, and how this feud helped influence the development of the attitudes of the English towards the people that they encountered in the American colonies. Now, there's a whole lot more of this story, which we'll touch on some more in some upcoming videos. But as for now, hopefully this commentary here has allowed you to climb just one more rung up the ladder out of the pit to enter into the free world where life is much better, right? And it makes more sense. And so this is the end of part 5 commentary on the book right here, Race in North America, by the master, Dr. Audrey Smedley. And so I want to thank you right now for watching all the way until the end. And my name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.